Petermann. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Justice Ecology Project, which is based in Heinsberg, Vermont. Vermont is a state that's near the United States, kind of between the US and Canada. And we've been involved in the processes around the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is what this event is, since 2004. And what we've seen since that time, especially since Bali in 2007, where civil society really came out in force around issues of concern, especially to indigenous people, particularly the RED issue, the reducing emissions from deforestation issue. Since we've seen so much civil society participation growing, we've also seen the crackdown on civil society participation here. So it really started in Bali with this blooming of participation by civil society organizations around very important issues of injustice that were being pushed forward inside the negotiations. And then since then, it's become even worse and worse. So after Bali was Poznan in 2008, and again, indigenous peoples, largely with their allies, stood up against RED and did unpermitted protests in the hallways to get media attention. That was one of the most successful tactics in Bali, was when the indigenous peoples, after being shut out of a meeting forcibly by Ivo de Boer, who was then the executive secretary, did a spontaneous press conference with GJEP support out front of the media tent. They got huge media coverage all over the world with these gags that said UNFCCC across their mouth. And so that sort of set a standard for a way to get media attention, is to do something spontaneous, colorful, that the media wants to see. So that was repeated in Poznan. Indigenous peoples held a spontaneous press conference outside of the media center, got a lot of media coverage. And then at the end of Poznan, we learned that the 2009 climate conference in Copenhagen, which was the one where the UNFCCC was supposed to come up with the legally binding agreement that would succeed the Kyoto Protocol when it was finally expired in 2012, would be the next round of agreements. That was where it was supposed to be nailed down, was in Copenhagen. And so people around the world mobilized to say, we demand something real. This nonsense that you people have been talking about with non-binding, voluntary, agreements is not working. So people came out in force to mobilize around Copenhagen, and also because we learned that the first day of the Copenhagen climate talks was going to be on the 10-year anniversary of the shutdown of the WTO in Seattle. And to us, the UNFCCC, this climate conference, had become the World Carbon Trade Organization, since that was the fundamental way that it was trying to deal with carbon emissions, was through these carbon offsets and carbon trading market-based mechanisms, which mean basically nothing except business as usual. So people mobilized around the world for Copenhagen, and in Poznan we announced that people would be mobilizing around the world for the Copenhagen climate talks at a CJN press conference on the inside of the climate talks. And the next day, the UNFCCC Secretariat pushed the climate talks back a week. So they would no longer start on December 30th of 2009, but would start on November 6th. So we felt that was a pretty big victory, that we forced them to push back the climate talks just by threat of protest. And indeed, the Copenhagen climate talks ended up being quite massive, with protests not just in Copenhagen but around the world. And we did this great Reclaim Power action where people marched out from the inside of the climate talks while they marched to the exterior fence from the outside of the climate talks. And the idea was to meet in the middle and have a people's assembly to talk about how we as the people could figure out our own solutions to climate change, since the governments of the world had no intention of doing anything about it. And some of the Latin American countries actually joined that march out from the inside. But the police reacted very badly, and they really beat the hell out of people. Both the people marching out, the actual accredited delegates marching out of the building, were beaten by the Copenhagen police, and the people who were marching to the fence from the outside were beaten by the police. And some people with our delegation were actually thrown off the truck where they were announcing, doing chants and so on, and arrested in Copenhagen. So that was where we first saw the first real crackdown on civil society, was in Copenhagen, because there was so much participation, because people were actually starting to take control of their own futures and demand real action, and even taking the action upon themselves. That was where we saw the crackdown really start. And then in Cancun, we saw the natural progression, as we saw with the WTO, where civil society was very much marginalized by keeping people out with giant fences. That's exactly what we saw in Copenhagen, that's exactly what we saw in Cancun as well. Except Cancun was even more extreme in that they had the NGO space literally a 20-minute bus ride away from where the official negotiations were going on, and then the media space another 10 minutes away from that. So it made it almost impossible for delegates who were interested in hearing what civil society had to say, who were interested in hearing the impacts of these policies on Indigenous peoples. It made it almost impossible for them to come to the side events that civil society groups were putting on. So that was probably the most extreme example of the marginalization of civil society. And as a result, Global Justice Ecology Project and other groups, the youth groups, held a number of unpermitted protests because the civil society space was being shut down. So it was physically being shut down by these giant distances between the different venues, but it was also being shut down by the fact that the UN requires permits to protest, and in Cancun, they weren't really giving them out. So people were requesting the permits and not getting them. And inside the negotiations, in the plenary session where all the decisions are made, the NGO participation is literally reduced to 1-minute interventions. And sometimes you have to split them with other organizations, so it turns into 30-second interventions. That's how much you're allowed to actually participate in the formal talks. It's 30 seconds here, a minute there. And if the time goes over, if the countries talk for too long, the country delegates, ramble on for too long, then the NGOs get cut off entirely, and the Indigenous peoples get cut off entirely and don't get to make any statements inside the actual plenary. So as we've seen this space shrink, people have reacted, civil society groups, by saying, okay, we need now to take direct action. And that's what we did last year in Cancun. We went into the Moon Palace where the official negotiations were happening, locked arms, and some people had gags across their mouths representing the different constituencies that were being locked out of the negotiations, from Indigenous peoples to women to Latin Americans to Asians, a whole litany of people that we were representing, and we locked arms and refused to leave, and were chanting about how the space was being lost to civil society. As a result of that, we all got thrown out, we got our badges taken away, and being the head of the delegation, I anticipated getting some kind of warning from Megumi or Warren, the two NGO liaisons here, about our behavior, about the fact that GJEP was going to be put on probation in this year in Durban or something, and I heard nothing from them, nothing. I even emailed Megumi to ask, can you tell me what's going on with this? I would like to know, and we never heard a word. So we registered as usual to participate this time and do the same thing that we do every year, which is make a space for the people's voices that aren't being heard in the negotiations to be heard, at least in the media, both mainstream and alternative media. That's sort of our specialty, as well as networking with our allies and all of these things that we do here. So here we are, registered as usual, no problem. Had been going in for a couple of days as usual, no problem. Then all of a sudden, we have red badges. And what that means is when the security checks our registration badges, the screen goes red, and theoretically sirens going off. They don't really, but basically it means you're not allowed to come in. And when I tried to come in yesterday, not only did my badge go red, Warren, who is the NGO liaison that we met with last year after he was warning us about unpermitted protest, was right there to meet me and said, "Hi Ann, can you come with me to the office because we need to talk about the fact that you came back this year after doing this unpermitted action last year, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen again." So, I said, well, I'm on my way to a meeting, so I couldn't deal with him right then. So he took my phone number, and I was supposed to meet up with him later. And then I got a call from Lindsay, another person in our delegation who had had a similar experience with her badge. I went and met her, and we did finally have to meet up with Warren, who had us look through their NGO rules for participation. And I asked him specifically about this rule book. I said, is this just for NGOs? And he said, yes, this is just for NGOs. And we went through it, and sure enough, it's, it would not be constitutional in the United States, let's say it that way. Not that the US is a wonderfully liberal place, but it says basically you're not allowed to have free speech. You can protest only with a permit. You can only protest in permitted areas. You can't hand out information without a permit. You can't do anything basically as an NGO in this space without a permit. If you do, you risk losing your badge and being thrown out. So, you know, there's basically no freedom of expression here for civil society organizations. And that's what we were trying to say in Cancun. And that's what we're trying to point out here in Durban, is that this is a highly controlled body, and as the Occupy movements around the world are pointing out, this body, as with many of the governments of the world, is controlled by the 1%. The governments that are here are controlled by corporations that make all of their money off of exploiting fossil fuels, off of burning fossil fuels, off of cranking lots and lots of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, magnifying global warming, magnifying climate catastrophe, which we're seeing already all over the world. And that's why they're here, is to make sure that that business as usual continues, not to do anything actually useful. And so that's another reason that we're here, is to point this out to the world, that this body is completely corrupt, it's completely, it just needs to go. We need something real in its place, and the real thing in its place is going to come from the bottom, as we're seeing with all of the Occupy groups, people coming together at the bottom and creating the change themselves. The change never comes from the top down, it always comes from the bottom up, and you know, that's one of the things we're here to do.